All righty, there's a lot of valuable time being used for this webinar. I want to make sure we respect that. Back in July, we had the legendary Steve Jones join us for an introduction to SQL DevOps. And we knew even then that we would want to have a follow-up and dive even deeper into this and help you navigate what this means for you and how you would apply it in your business, whatever that might look like. So we're very happy to have Steve with us again, kick off 2023 with another look at SQL Server. If you will, it's the sequel. we couldn't really ignore that joke. So with that, I will turn it over to our senior consultant, Scott Klein, who will handle this webinar with Steve.
All right. So, yeah, that's a great introduction, Jason. Thank you. And that I was actually going to I'll tail on to that. Yeah. So, Steve and I have been talking probably I don't want to say way too much because we had the initial webinar, probably 6 so months ago, Steve, and it was kind of this was the start of a project for me that in learning DevOps, from the database side. And the purpose of this webinar, like Jason said, we want to have you back because the purpose of this webinar was really to go, all right, what did we learn? Right, and kind of the hiccups along the way, kind of the learnings and things like that. So we'll get into that, but let me just kind of introduce myself. So Jason, and then we'll have Steve introduce himself. So Scott Klein, I'm the senior consultant here at SQL Solutions Group. Been here about 2.5 years. Been doing SQL Server for 30 plus years. Started with SQL Server 6. Maybe even before that, I don't know. Prior to coming here, I was at Microsoft doing a kind of data platform evangelist, but excited to be here. But really, this is a conversation with Steve and I and all of you. So I want to turn the time over to kind of Steve. Hey, Steve, introduce yourself, and then we'll kind of get into what we're going to talk about today.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me back. It's great to be here. So my name is Steve Jones. I've been at Redgate Software now for 16 years as an advocate, which is kind of like an evangelist that Scott used to do at Microsoft, but I do it for Redgate Software, where we build tools to help you work with software. I'm also the editor of SQL Server Central, which I founded with some partners a long time ago. And then I've spent 30 years as well working with SQL Server like Scott. I started with 4.2, so probably similar
that's right.
time
Yeah,
with Scott.
4.2. Yeah.
4.2. And I've been a DBA and a developer working with a lot of different companies and clients and employers across the years and building software and managing it. And I kind of used all that experience across the last 30 years to try to help people become better at their jobs, help them be better at working with SQL Server. And so I'm happy to come here and talk about DevOps, which has really been a lot of my life for the last 10 years.
Yeah. So let's talk about that because a lot about the DevOps, because Steve, when you and I were talking about this, like a lot of at least over the last 6 months, at least we have one client that we've been working DevOps with, and I know you're working with a lot, but even in that 6 months, a lot of our clients have come to us and other clients have come to us and said, we need to do, we want to get into database DevOps, right? So This is a trend. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm starting to see this trend where we've been doing it with applications for a long time, and now we want to do it with database, because now a lot of our clients are going, we need to start doing database DevOps. And so today what we want to talk about is what that means in terms of the challenges that we've run into, what we see, what's the conceptual foundation for doing database DevOps, kind of the like we talked about, kind of the learnings along the way, the high level of infrastructure, and the struggles that we get into, like the struggles I've had and that other people have that you work with, Steve, to go, on a day-to-day basis going, all right, same question over and over, but kind of struggles that we have. And especially, given not only do we have to do this on premises, but, Azure adds a whole layer of complexity on top of that.
Yep, for sure. It really, really does.
Yeah. So let's start talking about some of the challenges that we face, right? So you mentioned that you've got a lot of clients that you're working with to implement database DevOps, and some of the challenges I have. What are you seeing? Because the challenges I have is that that I had is that working with the client and some of our clients, they don't understand what database DevOps is, and they're like, just go implement it type of thing, right? And so,
Right.
you know, what is that? The number one challenge for me is, what does that mean, right? When I started this, it was, what does that mean, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something along the lines of what I see as well. That a lot of people that hear about DevOps, they want to build software faster, right? We want better software,
Yeah.
and so with the database, they struggle because we have this weird paradigm with databases where we typically work with code on SQL Server on the platform or
Yeah.
on Oracle, and we're not good about saving that as text files as code, which is right what the C# developers do, the Java developers, they kind of live in this text file world, and we don't do that very well. And so trying to teach database people how to work with those text files and then use all of our code and deploy that out to different environments is always a challenge. And then conceptually, this idea of let's make really small changes often is not something we do in the database world, right? Right, Scott, you and I often we try to put everything into one deployment and get it out there once a quarter because it's a pain, it's difficult, right? It's a hassle.
Yeah.
You know, and I think those cultural changes are really difficult for a lot of people to tackle. And then just the paradigm shift of working with text files and not living in Management Studio or, you know, SQL Plus or whatever thing you're doing.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree with that, because the conversation I've had with, you know, the client that we've, you know, have implemented with, plus another client that they're thinking about doing it, is that they have this mindset, hey, here's how we do stuff. Here's how we currently do it, right? And you have to go, well, like you said, it's a paradigm shift. You know, like you almost have to go, well, you can't do it that way anymore, right? And or hey, let's think about it a different way. And then there's a little bit of push, you know, I'm gonna call it a little bit of pushback to go, well, can we do X? You know, like, well, you know, let's maybe do Y that's close to X, right? And so we have this, the challenge is, like, for example, the client we have, they're like, well, and Azure, just like I said, adds this whole layer of complexity because, well, we do this, and in this scenario, you know, when we think about it on-prem, it's not that hard and it's not that costly to create a database, you know, and have every developer, you know, develop against on their local machine, right?
Right.
In Azure, that, you know, and you and I have had this conversation, it's Microsoft doesn't make that easy. And so this is that paradigm shift of, well, we have to think about this differently, and getting that, you know, in this scenario, getting them to go, all right, well, if I start creating a database per developer, there's costs associated with that. How do we overcome that?
Right. There certainly are costs, and then you lose some control, which I think has been a challenge for database people for years, right? That we want to have a lot of control, and you know, we're worried about losing control. We're worried about when things go wrong. We're worried about problems, and so that getting the mindset to change, not only how we might technically work with something, right, and deal with costs and you know, networking and all those other things, but just this fact that it feels a little bit out of control, and we're worried that we'll make mistakes and everything will fall apart, right? Which that's been a DevOps challenge for years. I mean, I think the C# and Java developers have faced that, but you know, because they use feature flags and toggles, they can turn stuff on and off, and they, I think, have gotten more comfortable across the years with those types of deployment.
Yeah.
Whereas the database people struggle, right? I'm sure. So Scott, I'm sure you saw that with Microsoft, right? Like they went from Visual Studio and TFS, which released once a year, right, or once every 2 years, to hey, we're going to go every quarter, right, and we're going to move this online, which was a huge mind shift change. Right.
Quicker.
And along. Right. And they had to bring the database along too. Like I think that was the same thing that they upgraded, and then they realized, hey, all this database stuff has to be part of TFS and Azure DevOps, or it doesn't work.
Well, I think that's Azure was a forcing function for that, right? That sort of was a kick in the pants for them to go, yeah, we have to do this. It was they had no choice type of scenario, right?
Right.
And I think from when you're doing DevOps in Azure, it's the same thing, right? So it's a forcing function to do that faster. And I think, you know, my question, you know, as you were talking, so you're right, I saw that, but like Azure was that, you know, we now have to, like you were saying, we have to have that that mind shift, that change to go, how do we do this differently, right? And that was one of the challenges. So I guess my question, and I'm asking you first, and I'll talk about it in my experience. But when you're talking with your clients, how do you help them overcome these challenges about quicker deployments, smaller, faster? How do you get them to grasp that, or call it grok that concept? Right?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of times I always look for the pain. I ask them what their goals are, what is their motivation, and for so many of them, they have this, we want to adjust to challenges or to business requests or anything quicker. We want to deal with feedback from customers, right? They have their various business needs in whatever industry they're working.
Yeah.
Okay, and trying to get them to then understand, okay, that what you do now doesn't meet those needs. So we have to adjust what we do to meet those needs. And it's hard because they all want to do better, but nobody wants to change.
Right.
And right. It's
kind
of like
database DevOps without changing anything. Sure.
Right. If they go on to buy a product, I'm like, I'm happy to sell you a product, but that isn't going to meet your needs.
Right.
Right. Because I see that often, that we do sell products at Redgate. We do help you with database DevOps, but people then don't want to change culturally or process what they do, and then they struggle to see benefits. And a lot of times it's, hey, we really just want to stabilize what's going on so that we can keep track of work, so we know what's being pushed out when, right? And then if we have problems, we know what to fix quickly. Right. So a lot of the initial work is the mean time to detect, mean time to repair.
Yeah.
Right, because knowing what we deployed, knowing when it happened, that helps us decrease those times.
Right.
And then when they start to go, well, we want to make these other changes faster to add enhancements, then you can start to talk about, hey, let's shrink the batch size. Let's break across multiple deployments. Let's get comfortable with deploying every week or every day at a pace that meets your needs.
Yep.
Right. As opposed to saying, the goal, especially with the database, is not continuing velocity, but it is that we want to deploy when we need to deploy, right? When we have to match what the application does, or we have to adjust something, we want to be able to do it quickly. And then trying to get them to remember that for the database, we're a foundation on which you build your software. So we don't want to thrash back and forth, right? If the application guys, change the text box to red to green to red to green, nobody cares, right? If they move it up and down, they can do that every day and we don't care. But we don't want to be adding columns and deleting columns every day because we haven't really thought through our design.
Right. Yeah.
We want to still have good design. We still want to have good software architecture.
Yeah.
Just when you're ready, let's deploy it very quickly so that we can go faster.
Yeah. In this scenario, when I was working with this client, their forcing function, their challenges was initially our developers are developing against production, right? And this was, we need to implement this super quick because we can't have that, right? And so as we were walking them down this path of database DevOps, right, and said, okay, well, then they started, hey, database, let's move, let's create a test, but again, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it was in Azure, and that just added this layer of complexity. We're like, okay, well, now how do we do this? So that was a challenge, right? Azure was a challenge. How do we do this in Azure and keep the costs low, right? And so in the many meetings that we had with them, and you and I, in fact, you and I had many discussions about this. We're like, let's talk about the pros and cons of, we laid out, and we laid out, well, here's the pros and cons of multiple developers developing against one database versus multiple developers developing against, each against a database, right? And the pros and cons. And you and I had many discussions about that, and that in turn led to many discussions with the client. And they ultimately said, well, we just, because of costs in Azure, that layer of complexity, doesn't mean it's not doable, but it just said they want to do, every developer goes against the same database. All right, what does that mean, right? All right. Yeah. And then, and so now we have to go, all right, that presented the next challenge, right? Am I not publishing your work?
Right. So that was interesting, Scott, right? Because Azure creates that other challenge, because backup and restore, right? Or refreshing development from production is a huge challenge in Azure.
Yes.
Because all of our experience with SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, whatever, has been, essentially dump to some format and then restore somewhere else.
Yeah.
And you can't do that in Azure, not
Right.
easily, right?
Yeah, not very easy.
Right. So that is certainly one of those challenges of Azure. But then, as you said, the challenges of working at a team and not publishing each other's work is something you have to think carefully about as you work through your architecture, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But and that was, I think that was, to overcome those challenges, that was really for us documenting the pros and cons of each, right? And
Correct.
saying, right, and then going to the client and saying, all right, if you do X, here's the pros and cons. If you do Y,
Right.
here's the pros and cons, right? And making sure they understand that, and then say, all right, what do you want to do? And they're like, well, we want to do X. I'm like, okay, right?
Yes.
Then that means this, right? And then, right? But
and that's one of those big challenges, I think, working with the database, is that it's not a little thing, it's a big thing.
It's a big thing.
It's a big thing with lots of these objects, lots of these, procedures, functions, store procedure, all that stuff. And as more developers work on that, it's so easy to push out work that's not done.
Yeah.
Because when we work in C# and Java, we tend to work in our own class files. We can see the changes in version control. We tend to know if there's something that might be problematic, right? Not always, but in general, we're pretty good about that. But in the database world, it's not so easy. And so your customer is kind of working in this model or state format, which is what, from Redgate, we would have SQL source control. From Microsoft, you would have SSDT database projects, other things. And when you package it up, you're trying to take the entire database, and it doesn't care if that work is done or not done, right? The whole thing goes.
Exactly. Right.
And that can be a problem for your application developers, right? Trying to split out that work is really challenging.
It is. 100%. Let's transition a little, because let's transition a little bit too, because we talk about the challenges, we help the customer understand the challenges, but then from that we have to then go and say, all right, well, let's help them understand from a conceptual standpoint, right? What this means, what's the foundation going to look like? What is this going to, from an end-to-end perspective, what does this look like, right? And so this was, again, and so coming into this from I'm not a DevOps guy, and two, I'm not especially not a database DevOps guy. What does it mean? So I had to go and say, well, what's, from 0 to 100, understand challenges, and then put together the conceptual, I call it the conceptual foundation, to go, what does this mean, right? And there was you and I, and I'm going to keep tooting your horn, because you and I had many calls and many emails back and forth going, is this correct? And you'd go, almost, or not even close, right? It's more like this, right? And so understanding that, and that helped me go back to the client, go, here's what it's going to conceptually look like, right? And so from a conceptual point of view, it's it's that understanding what the foundation means, and then you have to go implement it at the architecture, and that's a whole new level, right? So right, what is that? So conceptually, it's 1,000 foot, but when you go to the architecture, that's it's a whole new level, right?
Yeah, I mean, the devil's in the details, right? You have to understand at a high level conceptually what we're doing, so that we don't make too many missteps. But when we implement that, it is certainly a challenge to work through those details and then get your entire team on that same page, so that we're all in the same flow of building software.
Does that? But I guess my point, we can't overlook that conceptual. How important is that conceptual piece? It was critical for me, right? It was critical for me to understand, because then I could start seeing what the almost the end product would look like, right?
So I think it's really important, Scott, because if you think about how we talked about this, right, that at the beginning, when you're trying to think about it, you realize the way that we often do development, or the way your client was, right, which certainly is plenty of my clients, is very sloppy, right? Where we take shortcuts because we can. It's almost like when we started working with SQL Server, you could always use the name of the machine to connect, because we were always on a LAN, and Windows has a flat namespace on a LAN. It was very easy. And moving to a distributed system, especially my first SQL servers were all bridge networks, right? So a flat namespace. When you went to a routed network, things are different all of a sudden. And there's a complexity there, which we don't see so much anymore, right? Because we have smart network people now. But it's that same type of thing that at a high level, you conceptually want to know, hey, I've got production here, I've got development here, I've got my developers here. And how am I going to fit these pieces together at a high level, right? And I see, you've got the diagram here kind of with Git and trying to understand this. This is actually one of those things that I think a lot of people don't get.
Yeah. This is the thing that helped me understand, because I think I got this from you. I think I threw something together, right? And this is that scenario where you went, you were nice about it. You're like, well, you were close. right.
Well, this is one of those things I find, like, if you haven't been building software, and I don't mean database software, I just mean if you're working in Visual Studio and you're working with a team, then the way that we have to transfer code around and deal with it is much different than I ever did as a database developer.
Yep.
Right. And so I was lucky that I had some software development experience, so that this paradigm, as you see on the screen, where everybody has a copy of the code, is very different than it was 20, 30 years ago when everything was client server. There was like one copy of the code that we all had to work against. Right. And that is that's one of those challenging things for people to understand. And surprisingly, I do a lot of kind of light Git consulting with clients to help them understand how we're doing it.
And that's true too, because that could go back to a challenge, right? Because you're not only helping them understand DevOps, and now you got to help them understand Git, right? and a lot of them, if you're a developer, a lot of them already do, right? But but this went from a conceptual perspective. This went a long way, but but going back to the the actual architecture and implementation, again, that was a whole different story. And I've got another slide here that I'll show, but this went a long way to go, okay, I conceptually understand it. And when you go to, this was a huge win for the client, because when you present this to the client, they're like, oh yeah, the light bulb goes off. I understand it. I can help the client understand. They're like, right, I got it, right? But there's still the challenge. They're like, there's still a lot of questions. Well, but we do it this way. Does this conceptually fit with what we do? And you have to go back and go, no, or close, or no, and have that conversation with them to say, well, you really want to do it this way because, right?
Right. And the thing that I think, like, I like this diagram when you explain it, but the thing a lot of people miss on this diagram is that from that SSMS or SQL source control that you have there, I've got to remember that code has to go into that local folder, into that Git repository.
Yes.
Right. Which isn't something we're great at doing as database people in general. We typically go to that development database and try to figure out what to do from there.
Yes.
Rather than going, hey, every day, every hour, my code should be in a text file that then gets shared with all my other developers.
Yep. Yeah. That was. And you're right. That is a very good point, because in the discussion with our clients, they actually ask that. Well, does every developer have this? And you have to say yes, because that's their repo.
Yeah.
Right. That's their repo. And that was, again, conceptually, that was a kind of light bulb for me too. I'm like, okay, I'm starting to get this. But yes, and then you have that conversation, and you're absolutely right, because this was you have to help them understand, like, they have their own Git repo. It's not the Azure DevOps piece, but they have their own Git repo that they then are right. And they're like, okay, right. Because, and you can see okay, we understand that. Okay. That's, kind of help them overcome a concern, right?
Correct. Right. Doing that. And, and a lot of times, like for database people, I often say, like, Git is like what we wish replication was. Like, right, we say push and pull, and it just always works. Unlike SQL replication, right, which usually works, but not always.
Whole different webinar.
Whole different webinar.
Right.
Yeah, but this is the kind of thing too. When I look at this, right, like, we're showing 3 developers here. Like, this was a great thing, but the way that we move this code from developer 1 or user 1 to user 2, we could be going to staging server, right, or to QA server in the same manner is what we're trying to do.
Yep.
Right. And that's often, I think, with clients, trying to get them comfort that once my developers can share code, now all I'm doing is automating the process of making QA another developer, and I just deploy that code to them.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree with that. And the next slide I have which again you helped me put together with, because this is what I really loved. I would put something that, you didn't answer my questions for me. It was, hey, take a stab at it and then we'll review, right? And so I put something together, and you'd help me. Okay, yep, I understand. And then, okay, let's take it to the next step, right? And so the next slide I want to show is that next piece where, right, that actually, so, from our client perspective, we had to, it was honestly, because they've done DevOps from, like you mentioned earlier, from from the application code, right?
Right.
They've done that, and it was interesting for them to go, oh, this is somewhat similar to what we're doing with the application.
Yeah,
right.
It really is.
With their nuances of, oh, hey, are we going to have this, get repo at every developer? Yes, right. So there's those nuances. So that's conceptually, this was a great step, right?
Yeah.
For them. But then we take it from the conceptual standpoint. Okay, we got it to you helped me put this together, right? And this was another one. You went, no, you got to do that here and that there and that there, right?
Yeah.
And this was a huge, I'll call it taking that conceptual to almost implementation. Not quite implementation, but hey, here's what the architecture is going to look like. Right?
It was, right? Like, so I think, Scott, right, when we talked about, we worked through this, you had kind of two issues, right? One was pushing code from development to production, right? Which is kind of that left to right thing.
Yeah.
I don't know which way people see this, but we go left, right. But then we also have the refresh feedback from production to development.
Yeah.
Which was the whole other challenge. I think maybe the bigger challenge for this customer in Azure of how do I manage this piece, right? Which is, I think, related. There's a question from Skylar, which I think is similar, that this is a circle, as we're trying to develop code, get it to production and get feedback, but it's kind of two parts. One is going to production, one is feedback from production.
So let's take that, Scott asked it, would there be any way to keep a local development environment DB and just have a staging and production pipeline? Problems you described with Azure, such as no local development environments and refreshing development, are scary to me. That was the issue that we actually ran into. Was it here?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And this was.
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, so I guess, Skylar, the thing to think about, right, is that there is no really on-premises version of Azure SQL database, right? So that was the problem Scott had with his client, is that there's no good way to do this, because you certainly can, almost everything in Azure will run locally on SQL Server, but not everything, right?
Yeah. Right.
And the other problem is some things you could do locally in SQL Server won't deploy to Azure. Right, the PaaS service, right? Forget about VMs, but just the PaaS service.
Right, yeah.
And so they've since Scott and I started working on this, they've come out with this container version you could run locally, but it's still not quite the Azure SQL database, right? It's the edge version of SQL Server, which is close, but not quite there.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I'll add to that, Steve, by saying what you helped me understand, and hopefully this helps Skylar understand, is that it is scary, because this was the discussion, because you have this cost thing, right? But you have all these developers going against this one database. To overcome that obstacle, what, Steve, you helped me understand and made sure that I really pointed out to the client, was that there has to be a lot of communication between the developers, right? In this scenario, if I have multiple developers against a single database, like we see here, right? If even in Azure, if I'm developing in my own database, this really isn't not that scary. You just you got a cost, right? But for them, in this scenario, it's the communication was just so critical to go. All right, I am deploying my stuff, right? Am I ready to deploy? Make sure I'm not deploying Steve's stuff, right? Because, right? And that was the big scary stuff, to go, okay, make sure I am only pushing the stuff that I am working on. And that communication has to happen, right?
It does. Right, because ultimately what Scott's saying is, right, in this diagram, there's 3 developers down there. If you think about using schema compare in Visual Studio, or you think about using SQL compare from Redgate, if any one of those were to run that, they would see all the changes, right? I would see user 1, user 2, and user 3 changes all in a list. And if I don't pay attention, I might save that code, not realizing that user 3 isn't done, right? Their stored procedure really doesn't work right now.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's where that communication piece is huge.
It's huge, yeah. Right. And this is another piece that helped me, even though they still decided to go that way. And it's, look, and I'm not trying to talk bad about it. You know, this was what they wanted to do, and it was just it was helping them understand first the concept, like we talked about, first the conceptual piece, then the architecture, what it's going to look like. And then from here, this was another piece, Steve, where you said, let's make sure that I understand and that they understand what the steps are that's going to happen to make this a successful implementation. And right. And so, like, step 1, step 2, step 3, like step 2, every developer is going to get the latest from Azure DevOps. And step 3, I'm going to pull that locally. Step 4, I'm going to push my change, right? Things like that. We understand those individual steps to make sure there's a successful, right, and that communication happens. And so this is another slide I put together, and Steve went, let's talk about this.
No, I think this is great because conceptually this gives you that kind of overview. And then the details would be, you know, how do we actually do this? Like, what do you click or what do you run or whatever?
Right. Yeah. So when you go to your clients, right, do you present something like this to them, or, you know, how do you talk about architecture and their standpoint, right? Because this is this works for me and this works for them. But this, you know, what I'd like to understand is, you know, when we go to our next client, this may not work for them, right? And so, what's a learning we can take away from, you know, this scenario, right?
So a lot of this is very similar to what we do. So, you know, and for a lot of our clients, they have a process in place where they're developing code, and often what we try to do is minimize the amount of change at any one point in time.
Yeah.
Because it is very disruptive to a team, and you still have to get work done.
Yep.
Right. So a lot of times what we're trying to just do is let's capture stuff in version control, right? Which is kind of the previous diagram. Let's just get code. And then we can start to go, how do we deploy that code differently? Because if I capture the code, I can always email the DBA and say, please run this. Right. That's easy to do. Right. Yeah. And that's frankly how a lot of our clients still work. Right?
Talk about being scary. Yeah, go run this. Right.
But then we're trying to go, okay, let's, you know, once we know we've got this code captured, then we can start to go to how do we then deploy this to QA, right? Because a lot of times deploying to QA is less scary than deploying to production, right? Because even if we deploy to QA and they still want to do something manual production, that's fine, but let's still do that, which is still part of this process you're showing here, right? It's just the mechanics of whether it's in Azure or on premises or in a VM, or we don't really care, right? That's a detail.
Right.
So we are just saying, let's capture code, let's notify somebody. So what we've started to do for clients a lot of times is, rather than an email, once you capture code, let's create a pull request, and we'll let Azure DevOps or GitHub or something else email the DBA and say, there's code that's going to go to production.
Yeah.
Right. So we slowly start to modify the details of still this same conceptual thing that you're showing.
Yeah.
Right. What we're just slowly bringing automation throughout the entire process. And then usually once we get them comfortable with deploying code, then we start to talk about the other part, which I think for you was bigger, which is how do I take some of that data and some of that stuff in production and refresh development back?
Yeah.
Usually we talk about that later and just deal with that later, because once we've saved code, we don't really care whatever crazy process they have to do that, you know. And for most of them, frankly, it's still backup and restore or backpack and then apply the data to your application.
Yeah.
You know, we do try to get what we talked with you about of kind of making a gold copy of development database from production. And I have some clients that do that and they love it, but that's a huge cultural step for most people. Right?
Well, it was interesting too, because I'm glad you brought that up, because in the discussion with this particular client of ours, they started down the road of, hey, let's have we got our production database, let's have a gold copy.
Yep.
Let's, and let's work off that gold, right? And things like that. And they actually decided a month, after a lot of discussion with them, let's go away. Let's just not have that gold copy.
Right.
Right. And we'll just take that production, restore it to developer, because I think they saw that as, and I'm not, again, not right, wrong, or indifferent, not talking bad about it. It was their decision to go, I think that they saw there's a lot of work to go, okay, I'm going to take from prod to gold, just what I want the developers to have. Right. And so there was that was a lot of work, right? Where there was a lot of decision process. Okay, what do I take? Not just schema, but what data do I need? How do we get that data? Right. And from an architecture standpoint, there's you helped me understand, there's a lot of manual, there could be, and there is, but depending, some manual processes through this entire, CI/CD pipeline.
Right.
And they were like, well, this is going to be a lot. Let's just take this step out. Right.
Right. Which is still, I mean, conceptually, they're doing what we talked about, but in a grosser manner or a simpler manner, right?
It's a simpler manner, right? They accomplish the same thing. They're just like, let's just alleviate, let's just get rid of this one step, which is still okay, right? It's just, right?
Yeah, I mean, and what we're talking about, right, is getting production back to refreshing test or refreshing development, right? Which is, you can do it in any number of ways, right? Like, you can take production and just restore it to QA and dev, right? And then any code I have in Git, so I can just apply that code back if there's changes.
Yeah.
You just have to, depending on your requirements, your compliance, your regulation, you want to be careful, because actually today I just saw Nissan hired a contractor and sent them a bunch of data, and they didn't secure their database. And there's all sorts of PII in the development database that got breached. They announced today, right? Which is one reason why I say you just want to be careful taking that production data and put it in development.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it comes down to, you've put that stuff in a development area, like here in this diagram, and you haven't secured the development database like production.
Yeah.
Right. Because lots of people access this development database, or you didn't secure your Git repo.
Yeah.
And you put secrets in there or something else, right? You put your API keys or something else crazy in there, and and then all of a sudden you make the news. So
see, that's a good point. It's one of the things that we haven't talked about is there's still a whole security, and maybe we have another discussion at some point about the whole security level around doing database DevOps, right?
Yeah.
Because we continually hear about this company got hacked, this company got hacked, this company got hacked, right? It's not really tied to DevOps, but security is a piece of it. If you're doing DevOps, you got to think about security as well, right?
Right. Now, so what you've shown here, Scott, you have red and green, right? Some automated, some manual. Yeah. Really, any of these could be automated, right? Yeah. And even the automated ones still usually have a person clicking something or approving something.
That is true, right? And that's when talking about architecture, and I apologize for interrupting, because this was another for me. We look at this as a whole, architecture. But when I got into, and you introduced me to Renee, which is fabulous, because we spent probably 2 hours at PASS, helping me, and that was a whole architecture within an architecture, right? Going into Azure DevOps and building that, that pipeline and the release and helping me understand that, right? And that was, this whole Azure DevOps piece is, I want to call it a black box, but that's something to be understood in a whole architecture inside that.
Yeah.
Right? And
yeah, because there's a lot of steps there like that.
Yeah.
The line number 5 and the line number 7, right, where code comes out of Azure DevOps and gets to a database. Even though that's automated, usually somebody has to say, yes, send this.
Yeah, and so in this scenario, they're like, what? And I haven't updated, I haven't updated this, but yes, right. For them in this scenario, they're like, hey, I'm a developer. I'm going to push my changes. 5 is automated, right? It's automatically going to go to stage or test, right? Automatically, right? But you're right. I don't want automatically have that go to production, right? So you need that gatekeeper to go hit that, red button to go, all right, it's ready, approved, right? So even though it's automatic, it's still manual. It's just like, that's kind of, there's still manual to push the button to go, yep, now push to prod, right?
Right, and that's one thing I think I stressed to you. Like, I don't have clients that would automate this completely. So in the C# world, right, if the developer in number 4 pushed code out to Azure DevOps, number 5, some process would run and shoot it to stage right away.
Yes.
And then run some tests, unit tests.
Yep.
And if those passed, then 7 would automatically go and push to production, right? Like, there are lots of companies that do that with software, but I don't have any of them that do with database stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because ultimately the database stuff is foundational. And if the database were to rev, I could break something.
Yep.
Right. Or it could take so long, depending on the change, that I interrupt how production works. Right. I interrupt the workload because I'm changing data, or I'm doing something that's not a metadata change in SQL Server and requires, rewrite. Like, if I implement partitioning, I'm rewriting all these extents. And that can cause blocking and problems and other stuff.
Yeah, and so I should say to the viewers that this is not what you're looking at is not a hard fast, right? This is one way, but it depends on every client's going to be different, right? On what's automatic and what's manual, and like you said earlier, right? There's always going to be some manual processes somewhere in there. To stop, maybe I got to move this data, or, manually run a script to add this data, something like that, right? Along the way, right? So,
yeah. Like I said, I don't have any clients that let the computer make decisions about deploying code to production, not database code, just because you never know it's problematic. And even the ones that mostly deal with stored procedures and views, right? Those are easy to undo if I break something, but they still don't let those automatically go because somebody could slip a table change in there, and tables are problematic changes.
Right. Yep. Right.
So conceptually, almost everybody follows this thing. The details of how they would do this and where the manual steps are still there. And even with the manual steps, a lot of times there's a lot of automation. There's a lot of scripting. Things are happening. Right. Like, we're not copying files by hand. We're not, and we're typically not running commands. Usually it's somebody's clicking a button and saying, piece of software, go do this thing that you've been configured to do.
Yeah.
Right. So even these manual processes they're semi-automated. Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And one of the things that really came out from this project was, they wanted to go, I want to know, and I'm sure, and Steve, tell me if this is something your clients want to know too, but they said, we want to know 2 things, right? We want to know what changes have been made to a specific object over a period of time.
Right.
Right. And how do I know what's in the release I'm about to push to test or production? Right.
Right.
And that was for me, that would be cool to know. Right. Type of scenario. Right. So, again, I went to you and Renee, and I'm like, how do I find this out? Because, I look at this architecture, but, how do I know, that was a aha moment for me to go, they're going to want to know, hey, I updated this, here's table A. What changes have I made to this over the last month? Right.
Right.
Right. And because I can maybe go, well, what one of these broke it or something like that, right? And then if I'm pushing something in step 7, what am I pushing before I actually push the go button, right?
Right.
And this was a huge moment for me to go, that's important, right? That's 100% critical important. Both of those.
It really is. I think for a lot of our clients, when we show something similar to this architecture, what you miss on this is there's a depth to this, so that when you see the line 2 and the line 4, that's not like a file, right? That's not a database. That could be dozens of files, all these different changes, right? Because we want to track every single change we make to an object in SQL Server.
Yep.
Right. And so for any piece of work I have, right, any requirement or spec I've been given, I might touch 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 objects. Yeah. And I want to make sure I discreetly track those, so that when I do the deployment, or when I have a problem, or when I'm trying to figure out what could break, right, or what application developers have to be concerned about, I want to see those 5 or 10 changes all listed out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so this is conceptually right, but it simplifies it a little bit. You want to make people understand that this could be lots of files in 2 and 4 going back and forth, right? And I guess 5 and 7 as well. Same thing.
Yeah, exactly, right? So even though this is architecture, it's still sort of conceptually I love it a little bit, right? And that's why to me, it's like, okay, here's architecture, but there's still, the rubber meets the road type of thing where, there's still that, going into Azure DevOps and putting that whole CI/CD pipeline together. That was an architecture in itself, building that, right?
Yes.
And that was a whole learning curve. But that was probably, and I've said this before, huge kudos to you and thank you for introducing me. That was probably the greatest 2 hours for understanding how, that whole CI/CD thing works, right? And I'm still going back to you and Renee going, I got a question.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in the details of, right, it sounds easy. Let's push the code to Git. Let's build a database. Let's track changes and send them. But there's complexity in how that actually works.
And how that works, yeah. Because it's easy to go, you're right. I can say, let's do this, but then implementing that, what's that really mean?
Right. What does it look like with the team?
What does that look like?
And that's why I always caution people, like, I think we have some really great demos at Redgate of how to do this stuff, but I always caution that once you have a team, it's more complex than it seems, right? Like we make it look easy because it's one person sending code around. Yeah. But when 10 people are doing that, then it's much more complex than it seems.
Yep. I just remember standing next to Renee and he opened one of his examples and I went, whoa.
That looks easy, right?
It's easy. And he goes, yeah, this is this. And I'm like, can we just dumb it down a little bit?
Yeah.
Right. I'm like, 'cause I looked at his examples and I'm like, okay, oh man. Right. But you're right. There's a whole complexity around that and understanding that. And that's why, having those resources to go, I got a question. Right. But, because there's architecture. All right. So what I want to do, let's wrap up with in the last kind of 15 minutes, because I think this is an important point, right? Struggles of version control, right? Because we've probably talked about a lot of these, but going through this example myself, and I'm sure you've seen it too in your clients, there's just a number of struggles with version control and things like you getting over that paradigm shift, helping them understand that paradigm shift, doing smaller, more frequent things, telling them that, you can't do that or do what they want to do in this particular way. You have to do it this way, or here's a better, right? Things like that. Right. So there's struggles and then getting them to understand this whole DevOps from a database perspective. Right. And that's, and I'm sure what have you seen? Because I'm sure there's a whole bunch more and we're probably just, tip of the iceberg thing.
Yeah. I mean, understanding Git, I think, is the first thing, because at this point, I would say just Git is just kind of one.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like
the whole Git piece. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, for years ago, right, people would go, well, I want to use Vault. I want to use TFS. I want to use Subversion. Right. And you had to learn how to work with a bunch of different things, right? Source safe and other ones. But Git in the last 10 years, I think, has kind of just taken over things.
Yeah.
And so understanding how Git works a little bit, because how do I get my copy of code to you? How do you get your copy of code to me?
Right.
And then how do we review that work or make sure that we seamlessly kind of push it together?
Yep.
And application developers are pretty good at it, but I think they sometimes simplify it in a way that doesn't work as well for the database, because for us database people, the order of changes sometimes really matters.
Yep.
Right. For some things it doesn't matter, but some things it does.
Yeah.
And for application software people, it matters less because their compilers sort it out for them.
Right.
Right. So for me, a lot of times often what I try to do is get people to take a step back and set up like a little sandbox of Git for something, because your developers need to practice how they move changes back and forth.
Yeah.
If they're not comfortable with that yet, especially for database people. Yeah. But even for the ones that are, like, I try to remind them that in the database world, sometimes we have to manage work a little bit out of order. And so for us, it becomes helpful to understand how do I branch and merge code to control the workflow, because what the developers do and what the operations people may decide works could be two different things.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen as much in the application software world.
Yep.
Right. Unless you're crossing teams, like if you're if you do something, you have to deal with a queuing team that does messaging, then they might say, hey, you can make this change, not that change, right?
Yeah.
But for the most part, they don't have the problems we have in the database. So I always talk a little bit about being really good at branching and merging code in source control is like a critical skill for the database people to do things.
Well, is that, I agree with you 100%, right? But is that because, I'm just throwing this out there, is that because I think a lot of these tools obfuscate that for us, right? I click a button and it'll do X for me. Right. And, it's like, where, if I had to go actually type something, I'd learn it faster. But I think a lot of these tools sort of hide that, obfuscate those, so it makes understanding the whole Git a little more of a challenge.
It does make that a little more of a challenge, but just at a high level, conceptual understanding how to branch code and merge it and what that means.
Yeah.
And how do I decide what changes are going to go?
Yeah.
Right. And so, like a lot of application developers, and we find more and more clients going to trunk-based development where they're like, we test all this code and then we just merge it to this one place, and then that all goes to production.
So you're talking more from the merge perspective, right? Understanding that whole split merge scenario, right?
Yeah,
from that perspective. Okay.
And because of the impact on production. So
yeah,
I think one of the good examples is like in Management Studio, there's all these designers, right? Microsoft's done a great job of making it easy to make changes, but the way that it makes those changes sometimes is not what we would do. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So if you ever click the script button in Management Studio, sometimes you'll say, well, what it just did was it copied all my data to a temporary table, and then it did something else, and then it copied it back, or then it renamed something. And for a lot of us that have dealt with production, we're like, you cannot do that in production. Right? Like you cannot copy the data to a temporary table and do that.
Right. Yeah.
And so you'll just find those types of changes coming up sometimes.
Yep.
And the DBAs will be like, you cannot deploy this, or we have to deploy this in a different order than you sent it to me.
Yeah.
Right. And so I see that a lot of times, even with the way SQL Compare works from Redgate, which is fantastic, but every once in a while, the choice that it's made or the option you configured, the DBA is like, no.
Right. Yeah.
But when we have each of those individual changes captured, it's easy for me to branch and just say, hey, change 5 has to go first, and then change 2, 3, and 4 can go next.
Right.
Yeah. Or people go 2, 3, and 4 can go, but 5 has to wait until tonight.
Yeah.
Right. Because there's an index change, or there's a partition switch, or there's something that just would cause downtime.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's less downtime. It's more just impact to production.
Yeah, okay.
Where
that's a good point. Now you can understand, because that's something I really don't understand is, the branch and merge and all that kind of stuff. Right. And that's probably something I need to understand more of is that scenario. And you're right. That's that whole paradigm shift of helping developers go, what does that mean? Right.
What does it mean?
DBA, what is it? The DBA is going to, nope, not that way. Right.
Right. And even for the application developer, sometimes you think, right, like I make changes 3, 4, and 5. And then, let's say Randy is revving the application. Okay. And we say, we've got to push out this feature to a customer.
Yeah.
But Randy's like, hold on, change number 5 on my side isn't done. And so then we have to go, well, change number 5 from the database side can't go.
Yeah.
So we have to send 3 and 4 out without 5. And if you don't know how to branch and merge that well with database code, right, in Git, then you don't know how to send it out, because don't forget, all of our changes are foundational for the application.
Yep.
Right. So if the app people aren't done, then we have to pull stuff out, or we have to be careful what we release, which is why the trunk-based development thing is problematic for databases, not for application code, but for databases.
Yeah, that's true. Good point. Yeah, I didn't even think of that. So thank you for pointing that out. That's that's
I mean,
critical.
Right? Because the real world is chaotic. We know that. It just is, right? Things never go as we plan. But because we're first and then the application is second, sometimes what we think is done isn't really ready to go because they're not done.
They're not done yet.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good point.
So,
Good
so
point.
that's why I always tell them, one of the keys of DevOps is you got to be really good at version control, how to manage files
Yeah.
and move them in and out of branches
Yeah.
or copies, right? A branch is just a copy.
Oh man, and that's probably a whole nother discussion too, right? Because that's, we could probably talk, another hour just on how to do that, right? And
Yeah.
type of thing, right? And that's right.
And
What we're figuring out is there's this once you figure something out, there's a whole other thing you got to figure out.
but that's the DevOps thing, is like you kind of
Right.
keep going with what you're doing, and then we just make it better all the time. Right?
Yeah,
We don't stop and just change everything. And I really try hard with clients. I'm like, we got to minimize the disruption to your team. Let's change one thing. Let's make one thing better.
yeah.
And then we slowly improve things across time.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I think the takeaway would be, instead of doing all these one changes at one time, and which then makes this whole deployment, the merge and the, and the, just that complexity of that. If we, baby step into it, let's make one change, and as we start getting more comfortable with it, and then we can start making it a little more complex, right?
I mean, honestly, Scott, this conceptual diagram you have right now, sometimes we just have one person get all the changes and commit them, and nobody else worries about it.
Yeah.
Right. And then we go, hey, we've made a difference. We're capturing all this code in version control. And then once user 1 is comfortable, then we go, let's add user 2 or user 3, and you guys get your own repo and you can then see how this works. But
so you just basically one developer doing it, one guy. All right. Then
sometimes that's easy. Like you could just let the DBA, right? Because often
Yeah.
they have a good view. You just capture all the changes and put it in source control, and everybody else can just keep doing whatever crazy thing they used to do.
Yeah.
And then just over time, we educate you, we get better, we get confidence, we get, we understand the process better, and we just keep rolling it out further and further.
That's a really good point, right? That's a super good point. Right? Maybe baby step into that sucker.
Baby steps, yes,
Right.
yes, for sure.
All right, we got 3 minutes left. Are there any other questions? Let's open it up for Q&A. I didn't see any other questions. Jason, are there any other questions?
No others have come in so far, but
All right.
we'll see people take advantage of this last couple minutes.
All right, people, you got 3 minutes to ask questions. But in the meantime, Steve, thank you very much. This has been super helpful. I think again, I still think we're scratching the surface in all of this, right? Because there's, like we've talked about, I think, the whole Azure DevOps piece, the whole security piece. I think there's still so much to understand, but I think from an introduction, that these are the pieces, this conceptual piece, the architecture piece, understanding the challenges. That was a huge step in helping me get from, point A to point B, and understanding it at least at a maybe even a 200 level, right?
Right. Yeah.
So,
and that's really where we are, is like, a lot of times we're just trying to say, hey, if we have to help the application people and we want to deploy this week, we should be confident we could just do that. And that's what we're usually aiming to do.
Yeah. So Skylar wants to know any more meetings on this. Would love to showcase using SSDT.
Not for me.
Right. You know what? Yeah. Steve, let's have you back and let's talk. No.
Yeah.
You know what? We'll talk about that, Steve, internally, or sorry, Skylar, talk about that internally. We haven't been using SSDT, but I know Dan on our team is a huge fan of SSDT. Maybe he can do the next the DevOps webinar with SSDT. We'll see, but
I do love SSDT.
Yeah. I mean, SSDT works. Redgate's a competitor, so I wouldn't do it. But
I understand.
Conceptually, all this is the same, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just learning Redgate, so I'm not gonna tiptoe into SSDT. I'm gonna focus on one and be good at one thing, right? So, but good question, Skylar. Thank you. We'll talk about that and possibly do something in the future with Dan. Anyway, all righty, top of the hour. We're going to hold on. So let's just wrap up with. We had questions. So, Jason, you want to take this one away?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. As everybody knows, I would assume, SQL Server 2022 reached general availability in November, in fact, during the past Data Community Summit. And our own founder, Randy Knight, who is a Microsoft Certified Master, will be taking a close look at what we're excited about in this platform and help you figure out if it's time to upgrade. And I'm putting registration link in the chat, and we're ready to get you registered to join us in March when we have our next webinar. Looking forward to covering some of those exciting points. And as we wrap things up, I want to thank Steve again for sharing some of his valuable time. We appreciate his expertise. Very, very much a complex topic, but it's quite something to see it in action. And it looks like Scott's adding his email address.
I do want to do that because Steve had all his contact information. I'm like, man. So I guess if you have any questions about what we talked about,
yeah, reach out to Scott.
Reach out, and we'll. I'll probably be going, hey Steve, I got this question. All right. So, but thanks everybody for your help for attending. Steve, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
And talk. And everybody, we'll see you on the next webinar.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.